Hey everyone, welcome back to CreepyCorner Stories. You know, diving into the dark web is always risky, but sharing these stories with you makes it worth it. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Let me know in the comments below. I've noticed that these kinds of stories hit differently depending on where you are. It might even make the experience a little creepier. So, tell me, are you watching from the safety of your home or somewhere less secure? I found a dark web job offering to test a new vaccine. The side effects included nightmares about places I've never been. Okay, so I never thought I'd be the kind of person to post on here, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest before I lose my mind. If you're here for some kind of crazy, dramatic story about monsters and ghosts, maybe this isn't the post for you. But if you're interested in something that might actually happen to you, something that feels real, keep reading. Let me start by saying, I'm not an idiot. I've seen all the YouTube videos about the dark web. People messing with hitmen, ordering mystery boxes, or finding cursed live streams. I've always thought, who even goes to the dark web? You'd have to be insane. But here's the thing about life. It doesn't care about your judgment calls. When you're broke, desperate, and out of options, you'll do things you swore you'd never do. I lost my job a few months ago. I worked as a delivery driver for a meal kit company. You know, one of those fresh food to your door in 20 minutes places. When I got fired, it wasn't even my fault. The app glitched, and the GPS sent me to the wrong address 3 times in 1 week. They dropped me like I was disposable, and with rent due and no savings, I was completely screwed. I tried finding work on Craigslist, Upwork, TaskRabbit, even those sketchy Facebook groups where people post random cash jobs like assembling IKEA furniture or standing in line for concert tickets. But nothing was sticking, and my landlord was already texting me, "Hey, just a reminder, rent is due soon." Yeah, because adding a smiley face makes it better, right? Then, one night, I came across this thread in a Reddit forum. Someone mentioned a subreddit that leads to hidden job boards. They didn't exactly say it was dark web territory, but the comments were full of warnings like, "Don't go too deep," and "Some of these links are not what you think they are." At 2 a.m., with a glass of cheap whiskey in hand and desperation clouding my judgment, I clicked the link. The rabbit hole. Getting into the site was surprisingly easy. No Tor browser or hacking skills needed. The homepage was plain. Just a list of job categories with vague titles like data collection, product testing, and surveys. At first, it didn't seem too shady. I figured it was just some low-level gig economy stuff. But the deeper I scrolled, the weirder it got. There were listings for human behavior analysis, sensory experimentation, and unconventional trials. Some of the descriptions were super cryptic, like seeking individuals for unique psychological study, discretion required, high pay. One post caught my eye because the payout was insane. $10,000 for a single trial. The title, Vaccine Testing, Help Shape the Future of Medicine. I'm not proud to admit this, but I clicked on it without hesitation. 10 grand could solve all my problems. Pay rent, cover groceries, maybe even get my car out of the shop. The description was surprisingly straightforward. Participate in a groundbreaking medical study testing a new vaccine. Compensation provided immediately following the trial. Minimal risk. Confidentiality guaranteed. Apply now. There was a link at the bottom that just said, "Sign up," followed by a warning in bold, "Serious inquiries only. Failure to follow instructions may result in disqualification." In hindsight, I should have stopped right there. But when you're broke, logic takes a backseat to survival instincts. I clicked sign up and filled out the form. It asked for basic info like my name, age, and medical history. The only weird part was a question that read, "Are you willing to travel in your sleep?" I stared at it for a minute, wondering if it was some kind of typo, but eventually I just checked, yes. It didn't seem important at the time. The first contact. The next morning, I woke up to an email with the subject line, "Your application has been accepted." It didn't look professional at all, just plain text with a set of instructions and an address for a testing facility about an hour outside of town. The place was located in one of those industrial park areas, sandwiched between a self-storage facility and a weirdly empty McDonald's. When I pulled up, I was immediately uneasy. There were no signs, no logos, just a plain gray building with blacked-out windows. Inside, it was even weirder. The waiting room looked like a dentist's office that hadn't been updated since the 90s. The chairs were covered in that sticky faux leather, and the magazines on the table were so old they still had ads for MySpace in them. A man in scrubs appeared from behind a door and called my name. He was average looking, but had this eerie way of smiling just a little too much. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," he said. "We appreciate your willingness to participate in this exciting venture." He led me to a room that looked like a cross between a doctor's office and a science lab. There was a hospital bed, an IV stand, and a bunch of monitors. A nurse was already in there, preparing a syringe filled with a strange, bluish liquid. "Before we begin," the man said, "do you have any questions?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What exactly does this vaccine do?" "It's designed to enhance cognitive function and memory recall," he said, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Don't worry, we've tested it extensively. You're in good hands." Against my better judgment, I nodded. The nurse inserted the IV, and within minutes, I felt this strange warmth spread through my veins. It wasn't painful, just odd, like drinking hot tea on a freezing day, but from the inside out. "That's it?" I asked, expecting more fanfare. "That's it," he replied. "We'll monitor you for 24 hours to ensure there are no side effects. If all goes well, you'll receive your payment tomorrow." The nightmares begin. That night, they put me in a small room with a single bed, a camera in the corner, and a clipboard on the table with instructions. "If you experience any unusual sensations, please document them here." I thought I'd sleep like a rock after such a long, stressful day, but I was wrong. So wrong. The first dream started out harmless. I was standing in a parking lot outside a Starbucks, sipping coffee and scrolling through TikTok. It felt normal, almost boring, until I noticed the Starbucks logo was upside down. The baristas inside were staring at me, their faces blurred like they'd been smudged in Photoshop. Then, without warning, the sky turned pitch black and the ground beneath me started crumbling. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't work. When I woke up, my hands were trembling and my heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. I reached for the clipboard to write everything down, but when I picked up the pen, I realized my fingers were stained with dirt, like I'd been digging with my bare hands. The dreams didn't stop after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported to a place I'd never been before. A back alley in Tokyo, a foggy beach in Maine, an abandoned carnival in rural Texas. Each location felt too real, like I wasn't dreaming at all. I could smell the salt in the air, feel the cracked pavement under my feet, and every time there was something wrong. A figure standing too far away to identify, a door that wouldn't open no matter how hard I pulled, a clock ticking backward. By the third night, I started noticing something even worse. When I woke up, I'd have random objects in my room. A seashell covered in sand, a Japanese train ticket, a shard of glass with a red stain that I prayed wasn't blood. But the worst part? The camera in the corner was always off in the mornings, even though the red light was on when I went to bed. By the fourth morning, I knew something was wrong. Not wrong in the I'm overthinking this kind of way, but wrong in the I might not make it out of here alive kind of way. I woke up drenched in sweat, clutching a single playing card in my hand, the King of Hearts. The card had a jagged tear running straight through the middle, and I swear, it felt wet, like someone had dunked it in water just moments before. I don't even own playing cards. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed faint scratches running along the side of my neck, like I'd been clawing at myself in my sleep. My nails were clean, though, so who or what had done it? The clipboard was still sitting on the table, blank except for the shaky notes I'd scrawled the night before. Dreamed of the woods this time. Smell of burning leaves, something breathing behind me, but I couldn't turn around. Don't remember how I woke up. I stared at the last line for a long time. I didn't remember waking up at all. I couldn't even piece together how I got back into the bed. My brain was foggy, like someone had stuck their hand inside my skull and scrambled my memories around for fun. When the nurse came in later that morning, I tried to explain. I told her about the card, the objects, the dreams that felt like more than dreams. Her response? The same artificial smile I'd seen on every employee here. Side effects like vivid dreams are not uncommon, she said, her voice as flat as elevator music. The memories and objects you're describing are likely just projections of your subconscious mind. Totally harmless. Totally harmless, I thought. Lady, if this is harmless, I'd hate to see what dangerous looks like. Before I could press her further, she slid a clipboard across the table. It was a liability waiver, another one. The kind of document that makes you feel like you're signing away your soul. My stomach turned when I saw the heading, Phase 2 Authorization. I didn't remember them mentioning phases. Phase 2. I didn't want to sign it. Every bone in my body screamed at me not to, but as much as I hated myself for it, the thought of that $10,000 sitting in my bank account was louder. So I signed, trying not to notice how my hand was shaking as I did. The doctor from the first day came in shortly after. He handed me another dose of the vaccine in a pre-filled syringe. This time, no IV, just a quick jab to my upper arm. As the needle went in, I felt an immediate chill spread through my veins, colder than before. It was like someone had injected liquid ice directly into my bloodstream. "We'll check in tomorrow," he said casually, as if nothing in the world were wrong. The second night. I didn't want to sleep that night. I thought if I could just keep myself awake, I could avoid the dreams, or whatever they were. I paced the room for hours, checking my phone every few minutes, like I could somehow scroll my way out of this nightmare. But around 3 a.m., exhaustion won. My body gave up, and I passed out, fully clothed, on top of the covers. When the dream started, I was standing in a subway station. Not one I recognized, though. The signs were in Russian, and the air smelled damp, like mold and rust. There was no one else around, except for a man sitting on a bench at the far end of the platform. He was facing away from me, hunched over, his shoulders moving slightly like he was sobbing. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, slowly, like his limbs were stiff, and started walking toward the edge of the platform. I ran to stop him, but no matter how fast I moved, the distance between us stayed the same. My legs felt heavy, like I was dragging them through wet cement. By the time I reached him, he was already stepping off the platform. There was no train, though, just endless blackness. As I peered over the edge, I saw him falling, but it wasn't like a normal fall. His body twisted and contorted in impossible ways, limbs bending backward, neck snapping to one side. His face finally turned toward me, and I saw that he didn't have eyes, just empty sockets leaking something dark and thick like motor oil. I jolted awake, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. My hands were covered in scratches, deeper this time, and there was blood under my fingernails. My stomach turned when I saw what was sitting on the floor next to the bed. A Russian metro ticket, damp and crumpled, with smudges of oil across the surface. The missing time. The next morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. My phone's clock was off, like way off. It said 11:23 p.m., even though I knew it was morning. When I asked one of the nurses about it, she brushed it off, saying it must have been a glitch. But when I checked the timestamps on my texts, emails, even my Reddit app, they didn't make sense either. Whole hours of my life seemed to be missing, gaps in my memory where time just disappeared. I tried to check the camera in the corner of the room to see if it was recording, but when I climbed up on the bed to inspect it, I realized it wasn't even plugged in. The cord dangled loosely from the back, swaying slightly as if to mock me. The breaking point. By the end of the second day, I couldn't take it anymore. I told the doctor I wanted out, that I didn't care about the money anymore, that I just wanted to leave. His smile faltered for the first time, and for a split second, I thought I saw something dark flash behind his eyes. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice colder than it had been before. "You signed the contract. Phase 3 is already underway." "Phase 3? I shouted, my voice cracking. "What the hell are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. He just nodded to the two nurses standing nearby, who grabbed me by the arms and dragged me down a hallway I hadn't been down before. The walls were different here, metallic and sterile, like something out of a sci-fi movie. They threw me into a room with nothing but a chair bolted to the floor and a single, blinding fluorescent light overhead. I fought, screamed, begged, but it didn't matter. They strapped me to the chair, injected something into my neck, and left without another word. The nightmare bleeds into reality. When I woke up, if I even woke up, I wasn't in the facility anymore. I was standing in a cornfield under a gray, featureless sky. The air was thick and choking, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear something rustling in the stalks, something big circling me. Then I saw it, a scarecrow, nailed to a post in the middle of the field. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth was sewn shut with jagged black thread. But its eyes were human, wide open, bloodshot, darting around in panic. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me was soft, sinking, like I was standing on wet sand. My feet sank deeper with every step until I was up to my knees. I heard whispers, low and guttural, coming from the scarecrow. When I turned back to look at it, its mouth was moving, tearing through the thread, blood dripping down its burlap face. "You're already dead," it whispered, its voice distorted like a recording played backward. "You just don't know it yet." I screamed, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the facility, strapped to the chair. The fluorescent light above me flickered, and the doctor was standing over me, smiling again. "Welcome to Phase 3, he said. When the doctor said, "Welcome to Phase 3, I thought he was joking, or maybe trying to mess with me, play some kind of mind game. But there was no humor in his tone, no hesitation in his words. His smile was calm, calculated, and it made my skin crawl. "You're progressing better than we expected," he said, circling the chair like a vulture over a dying animal. "Most participants don't make it this far." "Participants?" I spat, my voice hoarse from screaming. "What are you even talking about? What is this? Some kind of sick experiment?" The doctor tilted his head, considering me for a moment. "You agreed to this, Mr. Carter. You signed the waiver, remember?" "Yeah, I signed a waiver to test a damn vaccine. Not..." I stopped myself, my chest heaving. What could I even say? I didn't have words to describe the horrors I'd experienced since stepping into this place. He leaned in close, so close, I could see the faint scar running across his forehead, like he'd once been split open and crudely stitched back together. His breath smelled faintly of antiseptic, sharp and sterile. "The vaccine is just the beginning," he said. "You're part of something much bigger now. Something groundbreaking." I wanted to argue, to scream at him, but the words caught in my throat. My mind was spinning, replaying the images from my nightmares, the scarecrow, the man in the subway, the upside-down Starbucks logo. I felt like I was unraveling, like reality itself was slipping through my fingers. "What did you give me?" I finally managed to choke out. "What the hell is in that vaccine?" His smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "You're not ready for that answer yet." The tests. After that, they stopped pretending I had a choice. Every waking moment was a blur of invasive tests and strange, incomprehensible procedures. They didn't bother explaining what they were doing anymore. It was like I'd gone from being a participant to being a lab rat, and they didn't feel the need to justify their actions to the subject. They hooked me up to machines I didn't recognize, with wires and electrodes running across my chest, my temples, even the backs of my eyes. One test involved submerging my hands in ice-cold water while I stared at a series of flashing images on a screen. The images were bizarre and disturbing. Faces contorted in agony, shadowy figures standing in doorways, symbols that seemed to shift and twist when I tried to focus on them. In another test, they placed me in a pitch-black room and told me to sit still. At first, I thought nothing was happening, but then I started hearing whispers, low, guttural voices, speaking a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to come from all around me, growing louder and more frantic, until I was covering my ears and screaming for it to stop. It didn't. I don't know how long I was in that room. Hours, maybe even days. By the time they pulled me out, I was trembling so hard I could barely stand. The nurse who escorted me back to my room didn't say a word. She just gave me that same plastic smile and closed the door behind her. The first transformation. The next time I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. My eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles so deep they looked like bruises. My skin was pale, almost gray, and there was a thin red line running down the side of my neck, like an incision that had been sealed shut. I pressed my fingers against it, and to my horror, I felt something move beneath the skin. I stumbled back, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But the more I stared, the more I noticed other changes. My pupils were dilated, far too large for the fluorescent lighting in the room. The veins in my arms were darker than they should have been, almost black, snaking up toward my shoulders like invasive roots. My fingernails had started to splinter, tiny cracks forming along the edges. I felt like I was falling apart, like my body wasn't mine anymore. The nightmares become real. That night, I dreamed of a place I'd never seen before. It was a small diner, the kind you'd find on the side of an empty highway. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, casting a sickly green light over the parking lot. Inside, the booths were empty, the countertops covered in a thin layer of dust. I walked through the diner, my footsteps echoing in the silence. There was something wrong with the air. It smelled sweet, like rotting fruit, and it made my stomach churn. At the far end of the room, I saw a man sitting at one of the booths. His back was to me, but I recognized him immediately. It was the man from the subway, the one who'd fallen into the black void. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. "Who are you? What's happening to me?" He didn't answer. Slowly he turned to face me, and I felt my heart stop. His face was twisted, stretched unnaturally, his mouth a gaping hole that seemed to suck in the light around it. His eyes were still gone, the sockets dark and hollow, leaking that same black, oily substance. "You're already dead," he whispered, his voice distorted and wrong. "You just haven't realized it yet." I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my room. I was standing in the corner of the lab, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed softly in the darkness. My feet were bare, and they were covered in dirt, fresh, damp dirt that smelled of decay. The doctor was standing across the room, watching me, with an expression I couldn't read. "You're progressing faster than we anticipated," he said, almost to himself. "Fascinating." "What's happening to me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why am I—" I gestured to the dirt on my feet, the blood under my nails, the scratches on my arms. "Why am I like this?" "You're evolving," he said simply, "becoming something greater." The realization. Over the next few days, or weeks, I'd lost all sense of time. The line between dreams and reality blurred to the point where I couldn't tell them apart. I'd wake up in strange places, an empty parking garage, a crumbling cathedral, a darkened forest, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Sometimes I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved in the periphery of my vision, just out of reach, their whispers filling the air. One night, I woke up in the middle of the lab, strapped to the same chair as before. The doctor was there, along with two other men I hadn't seen before. They were dressed in suits, their faces blank and emotionless. "It's time," the doctor said, his voice cold and detached. "We've learned all we can from him." The men in suits nodded, and one of them stepped forward, pulling a syringe from his pocket. The liquid inside was black, thicker than the vaccine I'd been given before. What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor leaned in close, his face inches from mine. For the first time, I saw something like pity in his eyes. "Don't worry," he said. "This is the final phase." The syringe plunged into my neck, and everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out after the syringe went into my neck. Hours? Days? Weeks? Time had lost all meaning. When I finally opened my eyes, I wasn't in the lab anymore. I wasn't even in the facility. I was lying on a metal table in a dimly lit room that smelled like mildew and iron. The air was suffocating, thick with the unmistakable stench of blood. Above me, a single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently even though there was no breeze. It cast long, jittering shadows on the cracked concrete walls. My head felt like it had been split open and sewn back together with rusty wire. I tried to move, but my arms and legs were strapped down with leather restraints so tight they dug into my skin. And then I noticed the worst part. I wasn't alone. Standing in the corner, half shrouded in darkness, was the doctor. His white coat was gone, replaced with a black apron that glistened faintly, like it had been freshly washed or freshly used. His smile was still there, but it had twisted into something far more sinister. It was the smile of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Good, you're awake," he said softly, as if we were old friends catching up over coffee. "What did you do to me?" My voice was weak, trembling, barely more than a whisper. He tilted his head, like he was surprised by the question. "We've unlocked your potential, Mr. Carter. You're not like the others anymore. You're something new." I didn't know what he meant, but I could feel it. My body felt alien, like it didn't belong to me anymore. My veins throbbed with a dull, icy ache, and every joint felt like it had been twisted just a little too far. My skin itched constantly, as if something was crawling beneath it. "What does that mean?" I rasped. "What did you—" He cut me off with a sharp gesture, his smile vanishing. "Enough questions. Phase 3 isn't about you understanding. It's about them." "Them?" My stomach turned. Before I could press him further, the doctor stepped out of the shadows and dragged a cart toward me. On it was a collection of instruments that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber. Blades, syringes, clamps, and tools I didn't even have names for. All of them gleamed under the flickering light, spotless and ready to be used. "You've been chosen to help us perfect the process," he said, as he selected a long, needle-like scalpel from the cart. "It's a necessary sacrifice, but I promise your contribution will be remembered." I thrashed against the restraints, panic exploding in my chest. "No! Stop! You can't do this!" The doctor ignored me. He rolled up his sleeves and positioned the scalpel over my forearm, right above the veins that had darkened to an almost blackish hue since the injections began. "This won't hurt much," he said, though the glint in his eye suggested otherwise. The experiment. The moment the scalpel broke my skin, it was like a live wire exploded inside me. Pain shot through my arm, but it wasn't normal pain. It was sharp and electric, like every nerve ending was being set on fire. My screams echoed off the walls, but the doctor didn't flinch. He cut deeper, carefully peeling back a thin layer of skin, and that's when I saw it. My blood wasn't red anymore. It oozed from the incision in thick, inky black streaks, almost like tar. It had a faint shimmer to it, as though there were tiny fragments of metal suspended within. "Fascinating," the doctor murmured, leaning in closer. He dipped his gloved fingers into the wound, pulling at something just beneath the surface. "Stop!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "You're killing me!" "Oh no, Mr. Carter," he replied, his voice calm and detached. "Killing you would be a waste. We've already gone too far for that." He grabbed a pair of long, thin tweezers from the cart and inserted them into the wound. I clenched my teeth so hard I thought they might crack, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. He pulled something out of my arm. It was a small black shard, about the size of a toothpick. It glistened in the light, almost like obsidian, but it wasn't a solid piece. It seemed to pulse, shifting and writhing as though it were alive. The doctor held it up to the light, his expression one of pure, unfiltered awe. "It's growing," he whispered. "It's integrating into your system perfectly, better than any of the previous subjects." I stared at the shard, my vision blurring from the pain and shock. "What is that?" "Progress," he said simply, dropping the shard into a small metal container. He sealed it with a hiss and set it aside. The others, after the procedure, they didn't take me back to my room. Instead, 2 nurses wheeled my table into a different part of the facility. This area was darker, colder, and I could hear faint noises, low moans, scraping metal, and something that sounded disturbingly like a child's laughter. They pushed me into a large room with glass walls, and that's when I saw them. The others. There were about a dozen people in the room, all strapped to identical metal tables. Some were awake, thrashing and screaming, their voices hoarse and desperate. Others were completely still, their eyes wide open but unseeing, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The ones who were conscious looked wrong. Their bodies were bloated in some places and skeletal in others, their skin mottled with patches of black and gray. One woman had thin, spindly growths protruding from her fingers like sharpened bone. Another man's jaw hung loose, dislocated and cracked, with something sharp glinting behind his teeth. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What did you do to them?" "This is the future of humanity," the doctor said from behind me. "A new evolution. These are the pioneers of what's to come." "This isn't evolution," I snapped. "This is torture. You're turning us into—" "Monsters," he interrupted, his tone mocking. "No, Mr. Carter. Monsters are what you were. What you're becoming is so much more. The escape plan. I knew I had to get out. If I stayed any longer, I'd end up like them. One of those broken, twisted experiments, trapped in a living nightmare. But escaping wasn't going to be easy. That night, after the nurses left me alone in one of the glass rooms, I started searching for anything I could use as a weapon. They'd left me unrestrained for the first time in days, probably assuming I was too weak to fight back. Big mistake. On the floor, half hidden under one of the beds, I found a shard of broken glass. It wasn't much, but it was sharp enough to cut through flesh, if it came to that. I hid it under the thin mattress and waited. When the nurse came in the next morning to take me for another procedure, I struck. I drove the shard into her neck, my hands trembling as blood sprayed across my face. She gasped, choking on her own blood, and collapsed to the floor. My stomach churned, and for a moment, I thought I was going to throw up. But there was no time for guilt. I grabbed her ID badge and bolted. I'll into the dark. The facility was a labyrinth of identical hallways and locked doors, but the badge opened more than I expected. I ran past empty labs, rooms filled with strange machines, and windows looking out onto darkened, overgrown courtyards. But the deeper I went, the stranger things became. The walls began to shift, almost imperceptibly, like they were breathing. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. And the whispers, they were back. This time, they weren't coming from my head. They echoed all around me, overlapping and frantic, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "Help me," I whispered to no one in particular. but there was no one left to help. I wish I could tell you that I found an easy way out of that nightmare, that I sprinted through the hallways, stumbled across an unlocked door, and ran until I saw sunlight. But this wasn't that kind of story. Every door I opened led to another hallway. Every turn took me deeper into something that felt less like a facility and more like a trap. The whispers followed me everywhere. Low, guttural, and relentless, they clawed at the edges of my sanity. I could hear my name in them now, hissed and stretched out like it didn't belong to me anymore. Carter! I turned a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There was a body lying in the middle of the hallway. It was a man, one of the other test subjects, judging by the strange gray patches on his skin and the black veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. His head was turned at an impossible angle, his jaw unhinged and hanging open like a snake's. His chest had been split wide, ribs splayed out like the petals of a grotesque flower. I stepped closer, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. That's when I saw something moving inside him. It was small at first, just a faint twitch, but then it emerged, climbing out of the hollow cavity of his chest like a spider from its web. It wasn't an animal though. It was one of the black shards, the same kind the doctor had pulled out of my arm. Only now, it was bigger, jagged, and alive. The shard pulsed and twitched, its edges glistening like they were coated in oil. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, watching, and then it started to crawl toward me. The chase. I didn't think. I ran. The sound it made as it followed me was like nails dragging across metal, a horrible scraping that echoed down the empty hallways. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it gaining on me though, its presence pressing against my back like a weight I couldn't shake. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I pushed forward. I rounded a corner and slammed into a metal door at the end of the hallway. It was locked, of course. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with the scraping sound as the shard creature came closer. My hand shook as I fumbled with the stolen ID badge, swiping it against the reader again and again. "Come on! Come on!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The reader beeped, and the lock clicked open just as I felt something cold and sharp graze the back of my ankle. I threw the door open, slammed it behind me, and locked it manually with the heavy deadbolt. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of scratching, slow, deliberate, and relentless. The shard was trying to claw its way through the door. I backed away, breathing hard, and turned to face the new room I'd stumbled into. The control room. It was a control room, but not like any I'd ever seen before. The walls were lined with monitors, each one displaying live feeds from different parts of the facility. I saw the empty labs, the testing rooms, the glass chambers, where the other subjects were kept, and then I saw me. One of the screens showed the hallway I'd just come from, the locked door at the end trembling under the pressure of the shard on the other side. Another camera showed the moment I'd attacked the nurse, her blood pooling on the floor as I ran. But the most horrifying screen was the one labeled Observation Room A. It showed a bed in a small, sterile room. A man was lying on it, strapped down with thick restraints. His head was tilted to one side, his eyes half open but lifeless. His veins were black, and his skin was pale and gray. It took me a moment to realize why he looked so familiar. It was me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not possible." The door behind me shuddered violently, the scratching turning into loud, metallic bangs. The shard was relentless, desperate to get in. I turned back to the monitors, my heart racing. The cameras started flickering, their feeds distorting as the whispers grew louder, surrounding me from every direction. Carter! You're already dead. No, I shouted, slamming my fists against the console. I'm not dead. I'm not. But even as I said it, I could feel it. Something inside me shifting, unraveling. My skin itched violently, and when I looked down, I saw the black veins crawling further up my arms, spreading like cracks in glass. The revelation. The monitors flickered again, and this time, they showed something else. It wasn't the facility anymore. It was the places from my dreams. The upside-down Starbucks, the subway station, the foggy beach. And then they started changing. The Starbucks burned, its windows shattering as flames consumed it. The subway filled with water, drowning the empty tracks. The beach dissolved into ash, the horizon collapsing in on itself like a dying star. Each screen showed destruction, chaos, and death. And at the center of it all, I saw the shards. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spreading through the world like a plague, crawling, infecting, changing everything they touched. This wasn't just an experiment. It wasn't about me or the other test subjects. It was bigger than that. They weren't testing the vaccine to cure anything. They were creating something new, something designed to take over. The final confrontation. The door behind me burst open with a deafening crash. I turned just in time to see the shard creature slither into the room, its edges glinting like razors. It was larger now, its form more defined, almost humanoid. It didn't lunge at me right away. It just stood there, watching, as if it were waiting for something, and then I felt it. A sharp, searing pain in my chest. I looked down and saw the black veins converging there, pulsing and writhing just beneath my skin. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest as the pain spread, radiating out to every nerve in my body. The shard creature moved closer, its jagged limbs scraping against the floor. It didn't need to attack me. It didn't have to. I was already becoming one of them. The last transmission. I don't know how I'm still alive, or if I even am. Maybe this is some kind of limbo. Maybe I never left the lab. I found a computer in the control room and managed to connect it to the outside world. That's how I'm writing this now. If you're reading this, don't look for the job posting. Don't search the dark web. Don't let curiosity or desperation pull you into this nightmare. Because if you do, you won't come back. And even if you do, you won't be the same. I paid for a secret FB, I report, on the dark web about UFO sightings. The report mentioned my birthplace as a landing zone. Look, I'm not proud of this, but about 6 months ago, I went down one of those internet rabbit holes. You know, the kind you don't really want to admit to because it makes you sound like a lunatic. It started like any normal night. Me, scrolling TikTok at 2 a.m., half awake, one cat purring on my chest. I came across some random conspiracy video about UFO sightings being linked to small towns in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't even a good video. The narrator sounded like he was 12 years old and recorded it in his mom's bathroom. But something about it stuck with me. I grew up in one of those small, middle-of-nowhere towns. Population 1,200, 2 stoplights, and one creepy abandoned warehouse the kids dared each other to break into. It was the kind of place that didn't even have a Starbucks or McDonald's, just a local diner where old men drank coffee and whispered about things that weren't right. So yeah, when I heard the narrator rattle off a list of locations rumored to be hotspots for extraterrestrial activity, I nearly dropped my phone. There it was, my hometown. I'm not going to say the name because honestly, I'm still freaked out and I don't want anyone showing up there because of this story. But hearing it out loud made my stomach drop. I'd never heard anything about UFOs growing up. Sure, there were stories about weird lights in the woods or random power outages, but it was the kind of stuff kids made up to scare each other. At least, that's what I thought. I spent the next few hours Googling everything I could find about UFO sightings in my area. Nothing came up. No news reports, no old blog posts, nothing. That should have been the end of it. I should have closed my laptop, taken a melatonin, and gone to sleep like a normal person. But my brain wouldn't let it go. And that's how I ended up on the dark web. Now, before you freak out, I'm not some tech wizard. I barely know how to use Reddit. But I'd heard about the dark web from all those YouTube horror stories. People buying haunted dolls, cursed paintings, and all sorts of illegal crap. I figured if there was any place to find secret UFO documents, it'd be there. So, I downloaded Tor, clicked around a few sketchy forums, and eventually found myself on a site called Ethereal Archives. The homepage was simple, a black background with white text. Secrets the government doesn't want you to know, it said. Beneath that, there were categories like paranormal sightings, cryptids, unsolved murders, and of course, UFO reports. I clicked the UFO section, and that's when I saw it. Exclusive FBI reports on extraterrestrial activity. $500. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is obviously a scam. And you're right, it probably was. But something about the listing caught my eye. It wasn't just the price or the flashy promises. It was the sample report they'd posted. It looked legit. The document was watermarked with the FBI logo, filled with redacted text and phrases like unidentified aerial phenomenon and military radar confirmation. It looked like something straight out of a WikiLeaks dump. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my credit card. Don't ask me why. I was tired, bored, and maybe just a little too curious for my own good. I figured the worst case scenario was losing $500. The payment process was weirdly smooth, considering I was buying something off the dark web. I sent the money in Bitcoin, which took me a solid hour to figure out, and within minutes, I got an email with a download link. The file was titled incident_709b.pdf. When I opened it, my heart started racing. The first page was a lot of technical jargon, most of it blacked out, but there were a few phrases that stood out. Unexplained aerial activity reported over redacted on redacted. Multiple eyewitness accounts corroborated by FAA radar data. Classified as a Category 5 anomaly. I skimmed through the rest of the document, trying to make sense of it. Most of it was redacted, but there was a section near the end that made me freeze. It was a list of locations designated as potential landing zones. And there it was again, my hometown. Except this time, it wasn't just a name on a TikTok video. It was listed as Site 709-B, with a note that read, high probability of recurring activity. Historical reports suggest localized anomalies dating back to redacted. I don't know how to explain what I felt in that moment. It was like the floor dropped out from under me. I suddenly remembered all those weird stories from when I was a kid. The lights in the woods, the dead cows, people blamed on coyotes, even though their bodies were always drained of blood. The nights when the power would flicker for no reason, even when the weather was clear. I thought about calling someone, my mom, my best friend, anyone. But what was I supposed to say? Hey, I just spent $500 on a dark web document, and now I think aliens have been hanging out in our backyard. Yeah, no. Instead, I did the one thing I probably shouldn't have done. I printed the report, packed a bag, and bought a bus ticket back to my hometown. When I got there, nothing had changed. The diner was still there. The same old men were still drinking their coffee, and the creepy warehouse was still falling apart. But something about the place felt off. It was like coming back to a house you grew up in, only to find all the furniture slightly rearranged. I decided to spend the night at my mom's house. She was thrilled to see me, of course, but I didn't tell her why I was really there. Instead, I spent the evening combing through old newspapers and local archives, looking for anything about UFO sightings or unexplained events. That's when I found the article. It was buried in the back of a 1997 edition of the local paper, right next to an ad for a church bake sale. The headline read, "Strange lights reported near Old Bell Quarry." The Bell Quarry. Of course. It was about 5 miles outside town, a giant scar in the earth where they used to mine limestone. The quarry had been abandoned for years, fenced off and forgotten, but I knew exactly where it was. As kids, we used to sneak out there to drink cheap beer and tell ghost stories. The article was vague, but it mentioned multiple eyewitnesses who claimed to see bright, pulsating lights hovering over the quarry. There was even a quote from a local farmer who swore he saw something metallic fly straight up into the sky before disappearing. I stared at the article for what felt like forever. Then, without really thinking, I grabbed a flashlight, hopped in my mom's old Honda, and headed toward the quarry. I'm gonna stop here for now. I know. This is the worst possible place to pause, but I need to gather my thoughts before I tell you what happened next. Let's just say things got a lot weirder after this. If anyone's reading this and knows anything about Site 709B or the Bell Quarry, please let me know. I don't think I'm the only one who's been looking into this, and honestly, I'm starting to feel like someone or something is watching me. It's funny how some places live in your memory like a postcard, but when you go back, they're nothing like what you remembered. Driving out to the Bell Quarry that night, it felt wrong. It wasn't just the darkness. I've driven those back roads a million times, even at night. But this, it felt like something was pressing down on me, like the air itself didn't want me there. The road leading to the quarry was still as busted up as ever, overgrown with weeds, potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. I killed the headlights when I got close, not because I was worried about being seen. No one's been out here in years, but because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. From what? I didn't know. I parked the car behind a cluster of trees and grabbed my flashlight. The fence around the quarry was still there, sagging and rusted, the no trespassing signs faded and peeling. I climbed through a hole near the bottom, one we'd carved out years ago with bolt cutters during one of our late-night beer runs. My boots crunched against the gravel as I stepped inside, and I swear, the sound echoed louder than it should have. The quarry looked exactly how I remembered it. Massive and hollow, a gaping pit in the earth surrounded by cliffs and piles of jagged rocks. The moon was bright enough to see by, but the shadows were everywhere, deep and shifting. I shivered, though it wasn't cold. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe scorch marks or pieces of debris, something that would scream aliens were here. But the place was empty, silent, dead. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt disappointed. Worse than that, I felt stupid. I was about to head back when I saw the tracks. They were faint, barely visible in the gravel. But once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. Tire marks, leading deeper into the quarry. They weren't from some rusted old truck like you'd expect out here. These were thick, heavy-duty, the kind of tracks you'd see on military vehicles. And they were fresh. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling the bushes on the far side of the quarry. But then I heard it again, a low, metallic scraping, like someone dragging a shovel across stone. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I killed my flashlight and crouched down, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound stopped. I waited, crouched behind a pile of rocks, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. Then, there it was again, closer this time. Not scraping, but footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night? I peeked around the rocks, careful not to make a sound. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows shifting under the moonlight. But then, near the edge of the pit, I saw movement. There were two of them, men, dressed in dark clothes, with something strapped to their backs. Guns, maybe? I couldn't tell. They were shining flashlights across the quarry floor, moving methodically, like they were searching for something. For a second, I thought about calling out to them. Maybe they were cops or security guards, though they didn't look like either. But something about the way they moved stopped me. It wasn't just the guns. It was their posture, the way they kept their heads on a swivel, like they were expecting something to jump out at them. Then one of them spoke, and my stomach dropped. "Check the readings again," he said, his voice low and clipped. The other man pulled out a device from his pocket, something small and rectangular with a blinking green light. He stared at it for a moment before shaking his head. Still no signal. Might have moved further down. Moved? What the hell were they talking about? I don't know how long I crouched there, frozen, watching them. But then one of their flashlights swung in my direction, and I panicked. I ducked lower, pressing myself against the rocks, praying they didn't see me. My hand brushed against something cold and sharp, a shard of metal, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't the kind of scrap you'd find at a construction site. It was smooth and polished, almost like chrome, but the edges were jagged, like it had been torn off something larger. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. That's when I noticed the scorch marks along the edges, like it had been burned. I didn't have time to think about it. The men were moving closer, their flashlights cutting through the dark. I shoved the metal shard into my jacket pocket and crawled back toward the fence, trying to stay as low and quiet as possible. I was almost to the hole when I heard the scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It was high-pitched, inhuman, and loud enough to make my ears ring. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The scream echoed across the quarry, bouncing off the cliffs and fading into a low, guttural growl. "What the fuck was that?" one of the men shouted. "Stay sharp," the other replied. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I scrambled through the fence, tearing my jacket in the process, and sprinted back to the car. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys in the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I gunned it, tearing down the dirt road and back toward town. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I drove to the 24-hour diner on the edge of town, the only place still open at that hour. I sat in the corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee I didn't even want, my hands still trembling. I pulled the metal shard out of my pocket, setting it on the table. In the harsh fluorescent light of the diner, I could see more details. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, faint but visible, like they'd been burned into the metal. They didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. I was so focused on the shard that I didn't notice the man sitting across from me until he spoke. "That's not something you should be messing with," he said. I jumped, nearly spilling my coffee. The man was old, his face weathered and lined, with eyes that seemed too sharp for someone his age. He was wearing a trucker hat and a flannel shirt, the kind of guy you wouldn't look twice at. "Where'd you get it?" he asked, nodding toward the shard. I hesitated. "Found it at the quarry," I said finally. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You shouldn't have gone out there. You sure they didn't see you?" "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, tossing a couple of crumpled bills on the table. Before he left, he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't like it when people start digging around. You'd better leave it alone, kid. For your sake." And just like that, he was gone. I should have listened to him. I should have taken the shard and thrown it in the nearest dumpster. But I didn't. I took it home. And that's when the real nightmares began. When I got home, I was still shaking, still replaying everything that had happened in the quarry. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and left every light in the house on, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. The shard of metal sat on the coffee table, catching the yellow glow of the lamp. It looked out of place there, too otherworldly, like it didn't belong in a normal house, in a normal town. I should have left it alone. I should have thrown it into the deepest lake I could find. But curiosity is a hell of a drug, and that shard felt like the answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking. So, I started Googling. At first, I didn't find much. Just the usual conspiracy theories. Area 51, Roswell, the government covering up UFOs. But then I got more specific. I typed in "Unexplained Lights Bell Quarry" and found nothing. It was like the place didn't even exist. No articles, no forum posts, not even a stray comment on Reddit. It was eerie, considering I'd found that old newspaper article earlier that day. That's when I decided to run the symbols through an image search. I snapped a picture of the shard, uploaded it, and let Google do its thing. Most of the results were gibberish, symbols from ancient cultures, random scribbles that vaguely resembled what was etched into the metal. But one result caught my attention. It was from a site called Silent Horizon, a forum buried so deep in the internet, it took me 3 tries to load it without my browser crashing. The thread was titled, "Unusual Markings Found on Government Property." My stomach dropped when I clicked on it. The first image in the post was nearly identical to the shard sitting on my table. Same metallic sheen, same scorch marks along the edges, same bizarre symbols. But the user who posted it wasn't talking about a quarry. They claimed they'd found their shard in an old Air Force base in Nevada. The replies to the post were unhinged, even for a conspiracy forum. People were throwing out words like recovered technology, reverse engineering, and black projects. One user mentioned a signal they'd picked up using homemade equipment, something they claimed was being broadcast by similar artifacts. It wasn't a language, they said, but a frequency. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. It was 4 a.m., and the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows. I felt exposed, like someone was watching me. I decided to call it a night. I shut my laptop, left the shard on the table, and crawled into bed, still fully clothed. I was too wired to sleep, but exhaustion eventually dragged me under. That's when the nightmare started. I don't remember all of it, just flashes. I was standing in the quarry, but it wasn't empty anymore. The pit was filled with things, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and skin that shimmered like oil on water. They didn't have faces, just smooth, featureless heads that tilted as if they were listening. One of them turned toward me, and even without eyes, I knew it was staring right at me. It raised a hand, long skeletal fingers ending in sharp points, and the air around me began to hum. The sound grew louder, vibrating in my chest, my skull, my teeth. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step toward me, then another, and the hum turned into a roar. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room was dark, the clock on my nightstand blinking 3:33 a.m. That's when I realized the hum wasn't just in my dream. It was real. It was faint, barely audible at first. A low pulsing vibration coming from somewhere in the house. I sat up, my skin crawling, and listened. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, and it was coming from the living room. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. The walk down the hallway felt like it took hours. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating through the floorboards. By the time I reached the living room, it was deafening. The shard was glowing. It sat on the coffee table, pulsating with a faint, sickly green light. The symbols etched into its surface were shifting, rearranging themselves in patterns that made my eyes water just looking at them. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a feeling, a pressure building in my chest, squeezing my lungs. And then it stopped. The light faded, the hum disappeared, and the shard went silent. But the room didn't feel empty. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the corner. A shadow darker than the rest, tall and thin, with long outstretched arms. My breath caught in my throat, and I swung the bat, but when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Nothing except the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with the lights on, clutching the bat like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Every creak, every gust of wind outside sent my heart racing. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just a hallucination. Sleep deprivation, stress, whatever. I wrapped the shard in an old t-shirt, shoved it into a shoebox, and buried it in the closet. But the weirdness didn't stop. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. My phone would glitch out for no reason, the screen flickering and freezing until I restarted it. My car radio picked up bursts of static, even on stations that were usually clear. At one point, my smartwatch started vibrating uncontrollably, displaying a series of random numbers before shutting off completely. Then, there were the people. It started with a white van. I noticed it parked across the street from my house one morning, the windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. At first, I thought it was a contractor or delivery driver, but it didn't leave. Hours passed, and the van just sat there, engine off, no sign of anyone inside. That night, I heard footsteps outside my window. I was too scared to look, so I just sat there in the dark, clutching the bat and praying whoever it was would go away. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the blinds, the van was gone. The breaking point came 2 nights later. I woke up to the sound of my front door creaking open. I don't care how deep you sleep. There's something about that sound that'll jolt you awake faster than anything else. I grabbed the bat and crept down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. The lock wasn't broken, and the chain was still hanging loose. Whoever had opened it hadn't forced their way in. They had a key. That's when I saw the symbol. It was drawn on the wall in what looked like black ash, the same shifting pattern I'd seen on the shard. Beneath it, a single word was scrawled in jagged letters: "Run." I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I grabbed the shoebox, stuffed it into my bag, and bolted out of the house. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. But wherever I went, I had the sinking feeling they'd follow me. I don't even remember getting in my car. I just remember driving. It was still dark, maybe 4 in the morning, the kind of dark that swallows headlights whole and makes everything feel smaller, like the world's caving in around you. The shard was in the shoebox, stuffed in my backpack, on the passenger seat. I could feel it, like it was pulsing. No, breathing. I didn't have a destination. My mind was too scrambled to think. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and my house, between me and them. But it didn't matter how far I drove. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started subtle, just the headlights behind me, glowing faintly in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a quiet road, a 2-lane highway cutting through fields and forests, and maybe they were just headed the same way I was. But then I noticed they weren't gaining on me. They weren't passing me. They were just there. I hit the gas, the needle on my speedometer climbing past 60, then 70. The car behind me kept pace. My chest tightened. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining things. Maybe it was just some trucker on a long haul, minding his own business. But when I hit 90 and the car behind me still didn't back off, I knew it wasn't paranoia. There was a gas station up ahead, the only one for miles. A single, flickering light above the pump, and a tiny convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. I didn't have a plan, but I figured there'd at least be other people there. Witnesses. Safety. I pulled in fast, the tires screeching against the asphalt, and parked as close to the entrance as I could. The other car, a black SUV with tinted windows, didn't pull in behind me. Instead, it slowed down just enough to pass by, the driver hidden behind the glare of the headlights. I watched it disappear into the distance, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The gas station was empty. No other cars, no cashier behind the counter, just rows of empty shelves and the hum of a fluorescent light flickering above the door. I went inside anyway. The inside smelled like stale cigarettes and burned coffee. The shelves were mostly bare, a few dusty cans of soup and expired candy bars left behind. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, its glass doors streaked with grime. I grabbed a water bottle from the fridge, mostly to have something to hold, and wandered toward the counter. The place was dead silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I rang the little bell on the counter. Still nothing. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, But that's when I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the store, near the back door, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought he was a mannequin. Too still, too rigid. He was wearing a long black coat, the kind you'd see on old war movies, and a gas mask that covered his entire face. The lenses of the mask reflected the dim light, giving him an insect-like appearance. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching me. Can I help you?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. My stomach dropped. Something primal kicked in, an instinct I didn't know I had. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and made my way toward the door. That's when he took a step forward. I bolted. The door slammed behind me as I sprinted back to my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him right behind me, but the parking lot was empty. I jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I didn't even bother buckling my seatbelt. I just floored it, tires screeching as I peeled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. For the next hour, I drove aimlessly, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. No sign of the SUV, no sign of the gas mask man. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shard was still in the shoebox, still in my backpack, and I swear I could feel it humming again, like it was trying to tell me something. I pulled over on the side of the road, my heart racing. I needed to get rid of it. It didn't matter what it was or what it meant. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get it as far away from me as possible. I grabbed the box, stepped out of the car, and walked into the woods. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of a cricket. Just me, my footsteps crunching against the dead leaves, and the weight of the box in my hands. I found a clearing about 50 yards in, and dropped the box on the ground. "This is your problem now," I muttered, my voice shaking. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. The hum. It started low, like a vibration deep in my chest, and grew louder and louder until it felt like my skull was going to crack. I turned around, and the box was glowing. The symbols on the shard were burning brighter than before, shifting and rearranging themselves in patterns that made no sense. The air around me felt heavy, charged with electricity, and the shadows in the clearing began to move. No, not shadows. Figures. They were tall, impossibly thin, their skin shimmering like liquid metal. Their heads were smooth and featureless, just like the figures from my nightmare. One of them stepped forward, tilting its head like it was curious. Its hand stretched out toward me, long fingers ending in sharp points. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on my back. My breath caught in my throat as the figure loomed over me, its hand inches from my face. And then it stopped. Its head snapped to the side, like it was listening to something. A second later, the clearing was flooded with light. The sound of engines roared through the forest as the black SUV barreled into the clearing, followed by two others. Doors slammed, and men in black tactical gear poured out, weapons raised. The figures vanished, dissolving into the shadows like they were never there. One of the men, his face hidden behind a gas mask, approached me. He didn't say a word. He just reached down, grabbed the shard, and slipped it into a lead-lined container. "Wait," I started, but he cut me off. "Forget you saw this," he said, his voice muffled and distorted. "For your own good." I don't remember much after that. One of them jabbed a syringe into my neck, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in my car, parked in front of my house. The shard was gone, and so was the box. I don't know who they were, or what the shard really was. All I know is that I've been looking over my shoulder ever since. Whatever it was, they didn't want me to have it, and I can't shake the feeling that they'll be back. After waking up in my car, groggy and disoriented, my first instinct was to check my phone. It was dead. Not just out of battery, I mean completely fried. The screen wouldn't turn on, even when I plugged it into the charger. The clock on my dashboard was blinking 12:00, like the power had been cut and never reset. It was as if time had skipped a beat. Or worse, like time itself had bent around me. I stepped out of the car into the cold morning air, rubbing the back of my neck where they jabbed me with the syringe. The spot was tender and sore, but I felt something else, something beneath the skin, a small bump. My stomach flipped, but I didn't have the courage to feel around too much. The house looked normal, eerily so. The same chipped paint on the siding, the same broken porch light that I'd been too lazy to fix. But the door was open again. I didn't even bother with the bat this time. I was too drained, too scared, too done. Whatever was waiting for me inside, I wasn't going to run from it. The living room looked exactly how I left it. The lights were still on, the furniture untouched, the coffee mug from the night before still sitting on the table. But the walls were covered in symbols. They weren't drawn in ash this time. They were carved deep into the drywall, jagged and rough like someone had used a knife, or claws. They stretched from floor to ceiling, looping and twisting into patterns that made me dizzy just looking at them. At the center of the room, my TV was on, the screen glowing with static. I hadn't turned it on. The hum was back. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, a low, pulsing rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. It was coming from the TV, the static flickering and shifting like it was trying to form an image. I stepped closer, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. The static began to clear, revealing shapes. No, faces. They were blurry at first, like someone had smeared grease across the screen, but they became sharper with each passing second. They weren't human. The faces were elongated, with black, soulless eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Their mouths were wide and lipless, filled with teeth that were too sharp, too perfect. They didn't move, but I could feel them watching me, studying me. Then, all at once, they spoke. Not with words, not even with sound. It was a voice inside my head, 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other, each one clawing at the edges of my sanity. "We see you." I don't remember screaming, but my throat was raw when I finally snapped out of it. The TV was off, the symbols on the walls gone. It was like none of it had happened, but I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I just sat on the couch, staring at the darkened screen of the TV, waiting for something, anything, to happen. At around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It shouldn't have. The phone was dead, remember? Fried beyond repair. But there it was, lighting up the room with a faint, sickly green glow. I picked it up, my hands trembling. There was a single notification. New message. No number. No sender. Just a message. I opened it. The screen went black for a moment before the text appeared, one word at a time. "You can't run." The phone shut off again. The screen cracked down the middle, like something inside it had exploded. I threw it across the room. The next morning, I noticed something strange. My reflection in the bathroom mirror wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me. But as I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't me. Not really. The reflection was a fraction of a second out of sync. When I moved my hand, it hesitated before following. When I tilted my head, it didn't quite match the angle, and then it smiled. I didn't. I stumbled back, knocking over the soap dish. My reflection stayed where it was, staring at me with that awful, unnatural grin. I grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror, my pulse racing. By the time the sun set, I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I didn't know where I was going or what I was running from, but I packed a bag and left. Driving through the empty streets of my hometown, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every noise felt too close. And then I saw them, the black SUVs. There were 3 of them this time, parked at random intervals along the road. Their engines were off, but I could see the faint glow of cigarettes behind the tinted windows. They were waiting for me. I floored it. The roads outside town were dark and winding, lined with dense trees that seemed to close in around me. My headlights cut through the fog, but I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The first SUV appeared out of nowhere, its headlights blazing as it sped toward me. I swerved just in time, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The second SUV slammed into my rear bumper, the impact jerking me forward. My hands clenched the wheel as I tried to keep the car steady, my heart hammering in my chest. They were herding me. I didn't know where they were leading me until I saw the sign, Bell Quarry, 2 miles. I don't remember how I made it there. The next thing I knew, I was standing at the edge of the quarry, the car long gone, my feet bleeding from running barefoot over the rocks. The SUVs were lined up behind me, their headlights casting long, jagged shadows across the pit. The men stepped out, one by one, all wearing gas masks. And then I heard it. The hum. It was louder now, almost deafening, and it was coming from the pit. I looked down and saw the shard. Or maybe it was something bigger, something the shard had been a part of. It was embedded deep in the ground, glowing and pulsing like a heartbeat. One of the men stepped forward, holding something in his hand. It was a small, rectangular device, covered in dials and switches. He pointed it at the shard, and the hum grew louder, the ground beneath us shaking. "You shouldn't have touched it," he said, his voice distorted through the mask. Before I could respond, the pit erupted. The last thing I remember is the light, blinding, searing, consuming everything around me. The ground opened up, and the men in the gas masks were gone, their screams swallowed by the roar. And then, nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious near the quarry, my body covered in burns and cuts. They didn't believe me when I told them what happened. No one does. I've tried to move on, but the nightmares won't stop. The hum is still there, faint but constant, like it's coming from inside my own head. And sometimes, late at night, I see them, the men in the gas masks, the figures in the shadows. They're watching, waiting, and I know deep down that they'll come back for me, because you can't run from something that's already inside you. I found a dark web stream promising live footage of the deepest parts of the ocean. The creatures on the screen had faces. I don't know how to start this without sounding like I'm trying way too hard to be dramatic, but I genuinely wish I'd just gone to bed early that night, or played Minecraft, or doom-scrolled TikTok until 3 a.m. like every other functioning insomniac. Anything other than clicking the link that took me where I ended up. I'll back up a little. I'm 24, work remote in IT, and have a horrible habit of killing time on the internet when I should be working. My daily diet of YouTube is a mix of urban exploration videos, creepy animated horror stories, and those scariest iceberg theories, tier lists. You know, the type of videos that make you wonder why you even clicked on them at midnight, but you can't stop watching anyway. Yeah, those. So, this all started a couple of weeks ago when I stumbled across a Reddit post. It was one of those blurry screenshots of a weird dark web forum with the caption, "Ever heard of Deep Sea Vault 99? Don't go there." I thought it was some kind of ARG, alternate reality game, or maybe a joke, but when I searched for it, I couldn't find anything. Nothing on Google, no subreddits, not even a sketchy 4chan thread. That should have been my first red flag. Curiosity got the best of me. I started digging deeper and eventually found some cryptic blog about obscure deep websites. One of the links in the blog was titled Deep Sea 99 Livestream, Not Safe for Work or Life. The text underneath warned about traumatic content and claimed the stream showed live footage of the deepest parts of the ocean, supposedly filmed by private research groups and government contractors. The blog made a big deal about how these were places too deep for any normal ROV, remotely operated vehicle, to go. Depths so extreme, the pressure would crush submarines like Coke cans. I should have stopped there, but like I said, I'm an idiot, and I've always been obsessed with creepy ocean stuff. The thought of weird, unexplainable creatures lurking miles below the surface. It's fascinating in the way serial killers and plane crashes are fascinating. You don't want to look, but you have to. Now, here's the thing about getting to the deep web. It's not as easy as everyone makes it out to be. I had to download Tor, use a VPN, and mess around with onion links until I finally found something that worked. When I clicked the link for Deep Sea Vault 99, it took me to a plain black page with a single line of text. You must confirm you are 18 years of age to proceed. Click here to enter. So, obviously, I clicked. The site was almost disappointingly simple. No flashy graphics, no edgy skulls or cryptic Latin quotes. Just a black screen with a live video feed front and center. The title above the video read, Deep Ocean Live Stream 5,387 meters below surface. Location redacted. At first, it was just what you'd expect. Murky water, a faint spotlight cutting through the dark, and the occasional bubble drifting past the camera. The timestamp in the corner said it was live, and I could hear a faint, crackling static in the background, probably the sound of the ROV's equipment. There was a chat window on the right side of the screen. Most of the messages were in languages I didn't recognize. Russian, Japanese, maybe German, but a few were in English, and they were weird. Did anyone else see that shadow just now? This part of the trench wasn't mapped. It shouldn't exist. Keep watching. It gets worse. Against my better judgment, I kept watching. The first glimpse. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Just black water and the occasional flicker of motion from tiny fish. The chat started spamming comments like boring and fake footage, and I almost closed out of the site. But then the camera panned to the right, and everything got strange. The spotlight landed on what looked like a smooth, metallic surface. It wasn't a rock, though. It was too perfectly shaped, like a dome. A man-made dome, sitting at the bottom of the ocean. The camera zoomed in slightly, and I swear I saw tiny scratches etched into the surface, like something had been clawing at it. The chat exploded. WTF is that? That's not natural. Looks like a hatch. Someone's been down there before. Before I could process what I was looking at, the camera shifted again, this time toward a dark crevice in the trench wall. The light barely reached into it, but as the ROV drifted closer, I started to make out shapes. There were fish at first, long eel-like things with translucent skin and empty white eyes. But then something else moved into the spotlight. At first, I thought it was another fish, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. Its head was too round, almost humanoid, and when it turned slightly, I swear I saw a face. Not a human face, exactly, but close. It had sunken eye sockets, a slit-like mouth, and a pale, grayish complexion, and it was looking right at the camera. The chat freaks out. The chat went nuts. That's not a fish. Is that a face? Turn it off. Turn it off. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, but I couldn't look away. The creature swam closer, almost like it was curious. When it got within a few feet of the camera, I noticed its skin wasn't just gray. It was textured, like rough coral or scar tissue. Then it opened its mouth. The thing had rows of teeth, but not like a shark. These were jagged and uneven, like someone had smashed them with a hammer and left them to grow back crooked. It let out a low, guttural sound that I could feel more than hear, like the vibrations were crawling through my bones. And then it did something that made my stomach drop. It smiled. I don't know how else to describe it. The corners of its mouth pulled back, revealing even more of those horrible broken teeth. It was a human gesture, but there was no warmth in it, just hunger. Something's watching. The stream suddenly cut to black, and for a moment I thought the whole thing was over. Then a new message popped up in the chat. Keep watching. It's not done yet. I hesitated. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my laptop balanced on my knees. But before I could decide whether to close the browser, the feed came back. This time, the camera was farther back, like the ROV had retreated to a safer distance. The creature was gone, but the crevice it had come from was still visible, and now there was movement inside it. Shadows shifting, something big stirring in the dark. The chat started spamming again. There's more than one. It's coming closer. They're not alone down there. The camera feed started glitching, lines of static flickering across the screen. I could barely make out what was happening, but I swear I saw another face. This one even bigger, with empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Then the screen froze. A final message appeared in the chat before the site went offline. They've seen us. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the blank screen. When I finally closed my laptop, it was almost 4 a.m., and I felt like I'd just come out of a nightmare. But the worst part? The next day, I found an email in my inbox. No subject line, no sender info, just a single line of text. We're closer than you think. I didn't sleep that night, not even a little. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the wall settling, the occasional car passing outside my window. I jumped at every single noise. That email, "We're closer than you think," kept playing on a loop in my head. I told myself it was probably just some automated thing tied to the site, some way to freak out curious idiots like me. But it didn't help. The rational explanation didn't stop my brain from imagining something standing in the shadows of my room, watching. By the time the sun came up, I convinced myself I needed to get out of my apartment. Staying cooped up in my place was making me paranoid. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my phone, and decided to walk to the Starbucks a few blocks away. Maybe a little caffeine and sunlight would help clear my head. Spoiler, it didn't. The man in the hoodie. The Starbucks was surprisingly empty for a Tuesday morning. The barista looked half asleep as she handed me my drink, and I found a spot by the window where I could people watch. At first, it was kind of soothing. Just normal people, going about their day, walking their dogs, arguing with parking meters. But then I noticed him. There was a guy across the street, standing perfectly still. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the kind you'd pick up at Walmart for $10, but the hood was pulled up even though it wasn't cold out. I wouldn't have thought twice about him if he'd just been walking or minding his own business, but he wasn't. He was staring straight at me. I tried to play it cool. I figured maybe he wasn't looking at me specifically. Maybe he was just zoning out. But as I sipped my coffee, I realized he hadn't moved. Not even a little. He didn't check his phone, didn't glance around, didn't shift his weight from one foot to the other. He just stood there, completely motionless, staring in my direction. I texted my best friend, Alyssa. Me. I think some weirdo is watching me at Starbucks. Alyssa. Lol, you mean he's checking you out? Me. No, like creepy staring, not cute staring. Alyssa. Take a picture, let me see. So, I did. I snapped a photo through the window, trying to look casual, and sent it to her. While I waited for her to reply, I glanced back outside. He was gone. The photo wasn't right. Alyssa's text came in about 30 seconds later. Alyssa. Haha. TF is that? Dude looks like a horror movie villain. I didn't even laugh. Something about the way she said it, horror movie villain, hit a little too close to home. I opened the photo again to take another look, and that's when I noticed it. He was closer in the picture. I swear, when I'd taken the photo, he'd been standing across the street. But in the photo, he was on the sidewalk directly outside the Starbucks window, just a few feet away from where I was sitting. His face was still hidden by the hood, but I could see his hands. They were pale and wrong. Too long, too thin, with fingers that almost looked stretched. My heart started racing. I looked around the cafe, but no one else seemed to have noticed him. The barista was scrolling through her phone, and the only other customer was typing furiously on a laptop with headphones on. I grabbed my stuff and left. Things get weirder. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was a nervous wreck. I locked the door behind me, double-checked all the windows, and even propped a chair under the doorknob, like I was in some low-budget slasher film. Then I opened my laptop to try and distract myself, but as soon as I logged in, I realized something was wrong. My desktop background had changed. It used to be this generic photo of a beach, something calming I downloaded months ago. But now, it was black, just solid black, with a single folder in the middle of the screen. The folder's name was Look. I didn't open it right away. I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself this was some kind of prank. Maybe Alyssa was messing with me. She's a huge horror fan and loves scaring people. But as much as I wanted to believe it was her, I knew it wasn't. She didn't know enough about computers to pull something like this off. And even if she did, she wouldn't have gone this far. Eventually, I clicked on the folder. There were only 2 files inside, a text document and a video. The text document was called Rules. I opened it first and my stomach dropped as I started reading. Rules for your safety. Do not turn off your computer. Do not cover your webcam. Do not attempt to leave your apartment until instructed. Follow all additional instructions promptly. Underneath the rules was a single line of text in bold. We are monitoring compliance. The video. I didn't want to click on the video, but it felt like I didn't have a choice. The file name was just a string of random numbers, like a date and timestamp, and when I opened it, I realized it was a recording of my own webcam. The video started with me sitting at my desk, staring at my laptop. It was clearly from earlier that morning, right after I'd gotten back from Starbucks. But the longer I watched, the more my stomach twisted, because there was someone else in the video. Behind me, standing just inside my bedroom door, was the man in the hoodie. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his head tilted slightly to the side, like he was studying me. His hood was still up, so I couldn't see his face, but there was something about the way he was standing that felt predatory, like he was waiting for the right moment to pounce. I slammed my laptop shut. My entire body was shaking. Whoever, or whatever, this guy was, he'd been in my apartment. Maybe he still was. The knock at the door. I didn't even have time to process what I'd just seen before I heard it. A knock at my door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just 3 slow, deliberate taps. I froze. The chair was still wedged under the doorknob, and all the windows were locked. But suddenly, that didn't feel like enough. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood there, staring at the door, waiting for whoever it was to knock again. But they didn't. Instead, I heard something even worse. A scraping sound, like fingernails dragging down the wood. It started at the top of the door and moved all the way down to the floor, slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wanted me to know they weren't in a hurry. I backed away, clutching the knife like it was some kind of magic talisman. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't even think to call the police. What was I supposed to say? Hi, someone hacked my computer, and now there's a creepy guy scratching at my door. The sound stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe they'd left. But then I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't angry. It was calm, almost friendly. We told you not to leave. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life than I was at that moment. That voice, calm, measured, almost polite, didn't match the sheer terror of what was happening. My grip on the knife tightened until my knuckles went white, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was on the other side of the door wasn't human, not in the way we understand at least. And the worst part, it knew my name. We told you not to leave, Alex. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't given my name to anyone, not on the site, not on any forums. It wasn't even tied to my email. So how the hell did it know who I was? The silence after that felt like it lasted hours. I stood frozen, knife in hand, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any second. But it didn't. No more knocks, no more scratching, no more voices. Just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. The chair had moved. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the peephole, the hallway outside my apartment was empty. But something about it felt wrong. The air was heavier, like the space itself had been tainted by whatever had been out there. I moved the chair away from the door, slowly and quietly, and cracked it open just enough to look outside. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. But when I turned back to shut the door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The chair I'd propped under the doorknob was sitting 5 feet away from where I'd left it. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even opened the door wide enough to move it by accident. The only explanation was that something had been inside my apartment while I stood on the other side of the door, knife in hand. The return of the folder. I locked the door again and shoved the chair back under the knob. But the truth was, I didn't feel any safer. Whatever this thing was, it had already gotten inside once, and it didn't seem to care much about locks. I opened my laptop, half expecting to find more weird changes, but when the desktop loaded, everything looked normal. My original wallpaper was back, the strange folder was gone, and there was nothing in my files that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd just had a really vivid, stress-induced hallucination. I was about to shut the laptop and take a long, cold shower when the screen flickered. The folder was back. This time, it wasn't called Look. It was called You Didn't Listen. I didn't want to click it. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to shut the laptop, throw it out the window, and run. But I knew that wouldn't stop it. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to just leave me alone. I clicked the folder. The new files. There were 3 files inside this time. Another text document, another video, and something new. A file labeled Live Feed. I opened the text document first. You broke the rules. You left the apartment. There are consequences. There was no rules section this time. No warnings. Just those 3 lines, bolded and centered in the middle of the page. I closed the text file and hesitated. The live feed file seemed to be waiting for me, taunting me. But I wasn't ready to see what was in there. Not yet. Instead, I clicked on the second video. The second video. This one wasn't from my webcam. It was grainy and shaky, like it had been recorded on a cheap phone. The footage showed a dimly lit hallway, the kind you'd find in any generic apartment building, but it wasn't mine. At least, not at first. The person holding the camera walked slowly, deliberately, down the hallway. The sound of their footsteps was muted, almost muffled, like they were stepping on thick carpet instead of tile. They stopped in front of a door. My door. The camera lingered on the door for a long moment before panning down to the chair I propped under the doorknob. Then, slowly, it zoomed in on the peephole, as if whoever was behind the camera knew I was watching. The video ended abruptly. The live feed. I felt sick. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely move the cursor to open the live feed file. When I finally managed to double-click it, a video window popped up. At first, I thought it was frozen. The screen was dark, with only the faintest hint of movement in the background. But then the camera adjusted, and I realized what I was looking at. It was a live feed of my bedroom. The angle was low, like the camera had been placed on the floor in the corner of the room. I could see my bed, my desk, the door leading to the hallway. And then, slowly, something moved into frame. It was the man in the hoodie. He walked into the room with that same eerie, deliberate calm, his hood still pulled up to hide his face. But this time, he didn't stop at the door. He moved toward the desk, toward the camera, and crouched down until his face filled the screen. Except, it wasn't a face. It was wrong. The skin was pale and stretched too tightly over his skull, and his eyes were too big, too dark, like twin voids. His mouth was full of those jagged, uneven teeth, and when he smiled, it didn't feel like an expression. It felt like a threat. He stared into the camera for what felt like forever, and then he spoke. "You shouldn't have broken the rules, Alex." The door opens. The video window suddenly disappeared, replaced by a black screen with a single line of text. Check your bedroom. I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to. But I also couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the knife from the counter, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was going to explode, and made my way toward the bedroom. The door was closed, just like I'd left it, but something about it felt off. The air around it was cold, colder than the rest of the apartment, and I swear I could hear faint breathing on the other side. I gripped the knife tighter and pushed the door open. Inside the bedroom, the room was empty, or at least, that's what I thought at first. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. The bed unmade, my desk cluttered with random junk, the window closed and locked. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. There was a single piece of paper sitting on the bed, weighted down by a small black object. I picked it up and immediately felt sick. The paper was blank except for a single line of text scrawled in red ink. Next time, we won't knock. The object holding it down was my webcam. I don't remember sitting down, but at some point, I realized I was on the floor of my bedroom, shaking uncontrollably. The knife I'd been clutching was lying on the carpet beside me. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no sense to be made. The note on my bed, the webcam, the line of text that felt less like a warning and more like a promise. Next time, we won't knock. I was losing control of the situation. Hell, maybe I'd lost control the moment I clicked that damn link, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. The laughing man, the first thing I did after pulling myself together was check every corner of the apartment, closets, cabinets, under the bed. I didn't expect to find anything, and I didn't. But it didn't make me feel any better. Whoever or whatever was messing with me didn't need to hide. They could come and go as they pleased. The locks on my door, the chair under the knob, the knife in my hand. None of it mattered. By the time I sat down at my desk again, it was almost noon. Sunlight was streaming through the blinds, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world outside was still normal. People were probably ordering Starbucks on their lunch breaks, scrolling Instagram, planning their weekends. But my reality had become a waking nightmare. I opened my laptop again. The folder was gone, but there was something new waiting for me. A notification. It wasn't from an app or email. It was a simple black rectangle in the corner of the screen with a single line of text. Join the stream. Before I could even react, my browser opened by itself, navigating to a site I'd never seen before. It wasn't Deep Sea Vault 99. This was something else entirely. The background was plain black, the layout minimalist. At the center of the page was a single video player, already buffering. Underneath the player was a title, Live, Alex's World. I froze. The buffering stopped, and the video began to play. The new stream. The first thing I saw was myself, sitting at my desk, staring at the screen. It was live footage from my webcam, except it couldn't have been, because my webcam was still lying on the bed where I'd found it. The camera angle was off too. It wasn't coming from my laptop. It was coming from somewhere above me, like it had been mounted on the ceiling. I glanced up, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the smooth, white surface of the ceiling. And then the camera started to pan. It moved slowly, deliberately, showing more of the room. The bed, the door, the windows. There was nothing unusual, nothing I hadn't seen 1,000 times before, until the camera stopped on the closet. The door was cracked open. Not much, just an inch or two, but I knew I hadn't left it like that. In the video, the camera zoomed in on the crack, the darkness inside it deepening as the image became more and more grainy. My throat felt dry as sandpaper, and I couldn't move. It was like my body had forgotten how to function, and then something moved inside the closet. It was subtle at first, just a faint shift in the shadows, like the fabric of a hanging coat swaying in the breeze. But as I stared, the movement became more pronounced. Something was breathing in there. The man behind the door. I didn't want to look. I wanted to slam the laptop shut, grab the knife, and run out of the apartment screaming. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The camera continued to zoom in, and that's when I saw it. A face. Or at least something pretending to be a face. It wasn't like the man in the hoodie from before. This one was stranger, more grotesque. The features looked mismatched, like they'd been cobbled together from different people. The eyes were too far apart, the nose was off-center, and the mouth. The mouth was wrong, too wide, too full of teeth. It was wearing a mask. Or maybe it was a mask. It was hard to tell. The skin was pale and stretched tight, like it was barely clinging to the bone underneath. But the way it moved, the slight twitch of the lips, the slow blink of the eyes, it was alive. It tilted its head, as if it knew I was watching, and then, ever so slowly, it smiled. The stream changes. The video feed glitched, the screen momentarily distorting into a mess of static and pixelated shapes. When the image returned, it wasn't my room anymore. It was another hallway. This one was narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that might have been white at some point, but had since turned a sickly yellow. The floor was covered in stained carpet, and there was a faint, flickering light at the end of the corridor. The camera moved forward, the perspective shaky, like it was being carried by someone walking. The audio kicked in then, a low, rhythmic sound that I recognized immediately. Breathing. The person holding the camera, if it even was a person, was breathing heavily, each exhale raspy and uneven. As the camera moved down the hallway, doors began to appear on either side. Each one was closed, but as the camera passed them, I could hear faint noises behind them. Whispers, laughter, the distant sound of something wet slapping against a hard surface. The room at the end, the camera stopped in front of the last door. This one was different from the others. It was metal, reinforced with heavy bolts and a rusted chain lock. The kind of door you'd expect to see in a high-security facility or a prison. A hand reached into the frame, pale and long-fingered, and began to undo the locks one by one. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent shivers down my spine. When the last lock clicked open, the door creaked inward, revealing a room bathed in harsh, fluorescent light. There was a chair in the center of the room, and sitting in that chair was me. The other. Me. At first, I thought it was some kind of trick, a cheap deepfake designed to mess with my head. But the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't a trick. It was me. The other me was slumped forward, my wrists bound to the arms of the chair with thick, fraying rope. My head was tilted to the side, and my face was pale and waxy, like all the blood had been drained from my body. I wanted to scream, to close the laptop, and pretend I hadn't seen it. But before I could move, the camera zoomed in on the other me's face. My eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot and wide with terror, darting frantically around the room as if searching for something, anything that could save me. And then slowly, I looked directly into the camera. "Help me." The message. The stream cut to black, leaving me staring at my own terrified reflection in the laptop screen. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then a single line of text appeared on the screen. "You are not alone." The laptop powered off by itself, plunging the room into silence. And then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing coming from inside the closet. The sound of breathing in the closet was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, slow, deliberate, like something was trying to keep quiet, but couldn't completely mask its presence. I stared at the closet door, unable to move, my mind spiraling into 1,000 worst-case scenarios. I could feel the air in the room shift, cold and oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The knife was still on the floor where I dropped it, just out of reach. My brain screamed at me to grab it, to defend myself, but my body wouldn't respond. Then the breathing stopped. For a few heartbeats, the silence was suffocating. And then, the closet door began to creak open, inch by agonizing inch. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know what was on the other side, but my eyes were locked on that widening crack of darkness, unable to look away. The thing in the closet. The first thing I saw were fingers. They were pale, unnaturally long, and wrapped around the edge of the door. The nails were black and cracked, curling like claws. The hand slid down the doorframe, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was inside wanted me to see every detail. Then the face appeared. It was the same face from the live stream, the mask-like grotesque patchwork of features that didn't belong together. Up close, it was even worse. The skin was slick and translucent, as if it had been stretched too thin over something it wasn't meant to cover. The eyes bulged, lidless and wet, with pinprick pupils that darted around the room before locking onto me. And the mouth. The mouth was an open wound, jagged teeth jutting out at awkward angles, as if they'd been shoved into the gums by someone who didn't understand how teeth worked. It smiled at me. The corners of its mouth stretched impossibly wide, splitting the skin at the edges like overripe fruit. I could hear the wet, tearing sound as it grinned, and the stench that wafted out of the closet was unbearable, like rotting meat left out in the sun. "You shouldn't have watched," it said, its voice a guttural rasp that sounded like it came from somewhere deep in its chest. The pursuit. I snapped out of my paralysis and scrambled for the knife. My fingers closed around the handle, just as the thing began to move. It didn't lunge. It didn't charge. It crawled. The way it moved was almost worse than anything else. It dragged itself across the floor on all fours, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, its joints cracking with every motion. Its head lolled to one side, the empty, bulging eyes fixed on me as its mouth continued to grin. "You broke the rules," it hissed, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You left. You didn't listen. Now we're here." I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted. My bare feet slammed against the hardwood as I sprinted for the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I ripped the chair away from the doorknob, threw the lock, and yanked the door open just as I heard it behind me. Not crawling anymore. Running. I didn't look back. The hallway. The hallway outside my apartment looked different. The lighting was dimmer, the air thick and heavy, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. I could still hear the thing behind me, its uneven footsteps echoing off the walls, but I didn't stop. I sprinted toward the stairwell, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. When I reached the door to the stairs, I flung it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. But the noise didn't stop. I could hear it on the other side, scratching at the door, the sound sharp and frantic, like nails on a chalkboard. And then it started laughing. The sound was high-pitched and broken, like static mixed with a child's giggle. It filled the stairwell, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I gritted my teeth, gripping the knife so hard my hand cramped, and started down the stairs. The building warps. The stairwell didn't make sense. No matter how far down I went, the floors didn't change. The signs on the walls still said floor 4, even though I was sure I'd gone down at least 6 flights. The air was getting colder, and the laughter hadn't stopped. It was everywhere now, echoing in my ears, rattling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I stopped at one of the landings, gasping for air, and that's when I saw the door. It wasn't like the others. It was old, made of dark, splintered wood, with iron hinges that looked like they'd been hammered in by hand. There was no floor number, no exit sign, just a small, rusted plaque bolted to the center of the door that read, "Where they wait." The laughter stopped. For the first time in what felt like hours, the air was silent. I stared at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It was ice cold under my fingers, and as I turned it, a deep, low hum filled the stairwell, vibrating through the walls. The door swung open, the room beyond. The room on the other side wasn't part of the building. It was enormous, impossibly large, with walls that stretched so far into the darkness I couldn't see where they ended. The floor was made of black, reflective stone, like obsidian, and the ceiling was covered in pulsing, organic shapes that oozed a thick, dark liquid. In the center of the room, there was a table, and around that table sat them. There were 6 of them, their faces obscured by grotesque masks similar to the one I'd seen in the closet. Each mask was different. One was made of porcelain, cracked and stained. Another looked like it had been carved out of bone. They sat perfectly still, their hands folded neatly on the table, their heads tilted slightly toward me. At the center of the table was a small black screen. The screen flickered to life, and my own face appeared on it, pale and terrified. The final message. One of them spoke, its voice deep and mechanical, like it was coming through a broken speaker. "You wanted to see." Another one turned its head toward me, the movement slow and deliberate. "You wanted to know." The screen began to glitch, my face warping and distorting, and then it was replaced by something else. The thing from the closet. Its grinning face filled the screen, and its voice echoed through the room, high-pitched and mocking. "We told you not to leave, Alex." The room began to shake. The figures around the table stood, their movements jerky and unnatural, and started walking toward me. I stumbled back, clutching the knife, but I knew it wouldn't help. They surrounded me, their masks inches from my face, and the last thing I heard before everything went black was their laughter. Epilogue. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. At first, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but when I opened my laptop, there was a new folder on the desktop. It was called Round 2, and this time, the rules were different.